One of the standard examples of market failures, one that you will find time and again, is that since basic scientific research yields knowledge which is not patentable and which cannot be kept secret, the major benefits from research go to people other than those who do it, and therefore there is no incentive. Let me give you a quote from a professor here at Stanford, Professor Henry Rowan of the Business School, in writing on energy, in which he says, and I quote, "Research, i.e., those activities in which the private sector underinvests because many of the benefits are not appropriable by firms." Well, now, let's stop and look at that. It is true that society has very great benefits from research. There are real third-party benefits. But is it true that society has not developed a mechanism to finance it without governmental assistance? Not at all. Society has developed a very ingenious mechanism. Universities exist, and universities are institutions which are selling three products. They are selling schooling, they are selling research, and they are selling monuments. And the monuments serve to finance the research. And the monuments are linked to the research precisely because the research has third-party effects and cannot have benefits that are appropriable. If Mr. X or Mrs. X wants to honor her ex-husband, Mr. X, no one would regard it as an honor to build a factory there and say that's the X factory, because everybody says, oh, well, that's no honor to them. They're just doing it to make money. On the other hand, if Mrs. X puts up a Mr. X library on Stanford campus, that's a great honor to Mr. X. Why? Precisely because it is associated with something which is rendering a public service and which cannot be appropriated privately. So that in fact, long before government stepped into the financing of basic research, there were in fact extensive funds being devoted to basic research through the development of institutions which engaged in tie-in sales of research and monuments. This case is very interesting and I think very important because it brings out another very important distinction that is often confused. That's the distinction between third-party effects, the effect on society on the average, and the effect of an additional measure. Let me go back to the research. Once you recognize that there would be a great deal of research, a great deal more research than can be justified by the returns appropriable by individual firms. Once you recognize this social institution that has grown up voluntarily to finance basic research, it's no longer so obvious there's any room for additional government funds. Now, I recognize that that's heresy in this room where most of us are being supported by those additional funds. But nonetheless, it's heresy worth considering. If there were no source of support outside of strict profit-seeking, narrow firm support, then you would have to recognize that the benefits to society from a little extra research will almost surely more than balance the costs associated with raising the funds to finance it that way. Because that's the other side of the problem. Every time government steps in, it has third-party effects too. The government invariably raises the money from people other than those whom it's intended to benefit. It invariably introduces friction into the society, and more important than any of this, it threatens the freedom of the society because of the intimate connection between limited government on the one hand and human freedom on the other. But nonetheless, if there were no source of support for basic research other than private profit-seeking enterprises looking at their narrow self-interest, almost everybody would agree that there would be a strong case for governmental subsidization. But now, let's suppose you have a great deal already from this private arrangement I've described. How do you know that it's worth having some more? If you'll pardon my jargon, how do you know that the marginal benefit is greater than zero? The average benefit may be positive, on the whole society may benefit. Let me illustrate how important this is. Henry Ford, when he introduced the Model T and developed the automobile industry, undoubtedly conferred enormous third-party benefits on the society as a whole. He made it possible for millions of people to live a different kind of life. Was that an argument for the government subsidizing Henry Ford? Not at all, because he had plenty of incentive to do it without the government subsidizing it. And at the margin, given that he was willing to do it and go as far as he was, it's not clear that extra development of that automobile would have added extra benefits. In the same way, once you recognize the importance of distinguishing between the margin and the average, the extra and the whole thing, you will immediately see that a very large fraction of all the arguments for government involvement on the ground of external effects, of neighborhood effects, of third-party effects, fall to the ground. Now, I do not want to suggest that you take the easy way. I don't want to say, whenever there's a problem, something will come up to solve it. I think that's too easy an answer. There are real issues here. Nobody can set forth a hard and fast line on what government should or should not do in concrete form. What all of us can do is to try to find out what are the principles on the basis of which to judge governmental activities. We have to think in terms of a balance sheet in which for any proposed governmental activity, here are the advantages, here are the disadvantages, how do they balance out? What I'm suggesting is, first, that we should be much more sophisticated in constructing that balance sheet than we have been. There has been so much of a tendency to look only on one side of the balance sheet at the alleged gains, not at the other, the costs. So much of a tendency to assume that the will is a deed, that if the intentions are good, the results will follow. So the first thing I want to emphasize is the importance of really exploring seriously what alternative mechanisms there may be for resolving these real problems before we turn to the government. Moreover, when government was very small, 50 years ago, when total government spending in the United States was less than 10% of the national income, when federal government spending was 3% of the national income, it was understandable that you could have a one-sided attitude. If in doubt, why not have the government try it? What harm can it do? But today, when government spending is 40% of the national income and federal government spending is over 25% of the national income, the situation is quite different. There is no excuse for this one-sided attitude, especially with the added experience we have had over the past decades of government failure. Indeed, as of today, it is hard not to start out by saying that the right way to go is to assume first that there's government failure before you look at market failure.